So we've talked a lot about NBA trades lately, right? That's just the time of the year. But we've talked about the main guys. Everybody else is talking about them. But what about some players that aren't being discussed in rumors that should be? Guys that probably won't get traded, but I think absolutely should get moved. First up, let's talk about Jeremy Grant in Portland. This is a player that I think can help a lot of different teams around the league, and for whatever reason, is just not really being discussed as a trade possibility right now. Now, part of that is probably because, one, he's kind of the only player of his, kind of archetype that Portland has on their roster as a guy that can play on both ends, is a good wing scorer for them. They don't really have that elsewhere on their roster as a two-way player, and for a team that already is pretty bad, they would get much, much worse by trading away Jeremy Grant. And it was clear based off the moves they made in the offseason that they wanted to try and at least be decent this year, trading for DeAndre Ayton, Jeremy Grant being re-signed, all that stuff. The other part of this that makes him maybe difficult to trade, of course, is the new contract that they signed him to this past offseason. And at the time that they signed him to the deal, they thought that Damian Lillard was going to be on the team. Obviously, he ended up requesting a trade not long after. And so he's on a massive deal. But Jeremy Grant's playing well this season, and he fills a role that a lot of teams need, and I think they could still get decent value. I'm not talking about multiple first-round picks, but I think Portland could get a late first for Jeremy Grant right now, or an interesting young player, and more importantly for them, get out of the contract as well, that had they known that Dame was going to request a trade, they probably would have gone ahead and signed and traded Jeremy Grant in the offseason anyway, rather than signing him to the extension. Portland's not going anywhere this season. This feels like a player that should be more available than he has been so far. Any of the contenders around the league that are okay taking on all of that Jeremy Grant money are probably going to be okay with trading away a late first, because in terms of actual on-court value, he's worth more than that. It's just the contract. So it could be a real bargain for some of these contending teams that still need a little bit more help on the wing. Even some teams that maybe you wouldn't think would be able to bring in someone like Jeremy Grant because they just wouldn't have enough, might actually have enough given the contract. I don't expect it to happen because there hasn't been a lot of rumors about it, and that contract is pretty difficult to move, but it's definitely something that Portland should be exploring, despite the fact that obviously it's going to make their team much worse this season. Next up now is one that I thought about for a little bit and finally decided on, and it's Chris Paul and Golden State. Now, obviously right now, Chris Paul is hurt, but he should be healthy or close to healthy by the trade deadline, and it's a massive salary and a player that there are Warriors games that I watch, and I wonder if Chris Paul should even be in the Warriors guard rotation. They still have Clay and Steph, and Podziemski has been really good for them. They have a good amount of guards, like Gary Payton once he gets healthy. They have a good amount of guys that they can kind of throw out there, and it did start to become a situation where I was wondering if Chris Paul just didn't need to be in the rotation for Golden State anymore. And when you're carrying that big of an expiring contract and it's a roster in Golden State that, needs to make some changes, I do think they could get something for him. Now, more than likely, they would attach stuff to the contract of Chris Paul in order to bring in a much better player. I don't think that he actually has, some tremendous amount of value. We saw that in the offseason, but I don't think the Chris Paul experiment has really worked. And with him being an expiring contract, rather than trading away Draymond or Clay, which we've talked about, it's a little bit easier to stomach the idea of Chris Paul plus stuff, or potentially, in a package alongside, Kuminga or Moody or someone like that, and going out and getting another player to help this roster. I think they have enough guards. I think they have a decent guard rotation, and you can honestly argue that Chris Paul shouldn't even be playing really very much at all for this team. Next one's a tough one for me. I'm going to put Mikal Bridges on the list. The Nets have been terrible the last 15 to 20 games, and I kind of just held on to this idea of keeping Mikal Bridges because he's on a really good contract. He's a good two-way player. He's not 30 years old yet, and it's just someone that you could see yourself, not necessarily building the team around, but as a foundational piece moving forward. And the contract was a big part of that because he played so well. At the beginning of the year, was playing really well. It's clear right now that Mikal Bridges still has a lot of value around the league, but this team offensively is just absolutely brutal right now with him as the main guy, and it's just not a role that makes sense for him. And it still feels like someone they could get multiple first-round picks for because of his two-way value and because of the contract that he's on. And like, if you're Philadelphia, for example, and all of a sudden Mikal Bridges is available, that's the perfect guy for their team, and they could trade the Nets multiple first-round picks, some of which that they got in the Harden deal, and then the Nets can just kind of move on from the Bridges thing and get value there. The concern for me, if I was Brooklyn, would be if his value continued to go go even lower in this like primary scorer role, potentially further limiting what you could get, whether that be through this year or on into next year. I'm not expecting this to happen. We've gotten multiple reports and rumors that the Nets are still planning on building around Mikal Bridges, but I've gotten to the point where I think it would totally make sense and they should actually really explore moving Bridges, because I think he would, kind of like Jeremy Grant, he'd be really valuable. Like there would be teams around the league that need a guy like that desperately, especially given some of his offensive improvement. And in a lower usage role, you would expect some of the defense that he showed in Phoenix to come back as well. I think he's a really valuable player, and given how poorly the Nets have been playing recently, it does start to make a lot of sense to move on from him. Next up is probably the weirdest one of the entire video. Hang with me on this one. I think it might be time for the Hawks to really truly explore trading Trae Young. Most of the rumors right now around them in terms of possible trade situations for them have revolved around DeJounte Murray, potentially to the Lakers, a handful of different teams. But given the fact that the team this year, like they've spent years, right, trying to put a good team around Trae Young and figuring out what that looks like. And at a certain point, you have to look at the roster and wonder if it just makes sense to move on from him. Because right now, if tomorrow, right, Atlanta was like, hey, we're open to trading Trae Young, he would arguably be the biggest name on the trade market. I mean, Pascal Siakam is out there, but his value is a little limited because of his expiring contract situation. Zach LaVine is an option for some of these teams. But like, if Trae Young was suddenly available, teams like the Lakers, like that didn't think they were going to be able to get a star on that level, suddenly would have the opportunity to. Now, we've talked about this in the past with potential Trae Young trades. He's one of the most difficult players to kind of place a value on as a trade asset, because he's so good offensively, but defensively there's a huge liability there. You kind of have to build your team around it. And so it might not be for, a crazy package in return for Atlanta, but maybe you do have to start looking at the roster and wonder, okay, we tried this thing with Trae Young in multiple different versions of the roster. It just isn't working. Should we capitalize on the value that he has now, rather than a year, 2 years from now, if he tries to force his way out while he's on a massive contract and potentially playing worse than he is right now? It's not something that I'm like super passionate about, like they need to trade away Trae Young, and I don't expect it to happen, but I do think it's something that should be considered and that they should be discussing, because Atlanta legitimately over the last 10 games or so has been one of the worst teams in the entire league. And at a certain point, you have to evaluate what this kind of Trae Young era of basketball has meant and what it has looked like. And with the exception of a few little bits of success, it has been very difficult to put a successful team around him. And to me, that means maybe you should start looking at making some pretty massive changes. Last up now is kind of a weird one as well. Terry Rozier in Charlotte. So LaMelo is back now, and Rozier's been having a good season, and he's been a good player for them for the last handful of years. He's not overwhelmingly expensive either. And when you look around the league and you look at some of these contenders, there's a lot of teams that could use a boost of offense. Even if a guy like Rozier is coming off the bench, they could use, just a little bit more force offensively. And he's been really, really good. Obviously, he's had to play an outsized role when LaMelo has been out, but I think he's someone that would have a good amount of value to teams. Obviously, Charlotte's not going anywhere this year. They've got their own guys on the roster like Brandon Miller, like LaMelo, that they need to prioritize. There's a couple of guys, honestly, I think on this roster that would be pretty interesting to contenders, PJ Washington being another, but Rozier is a pretty clean fit on a lot of different teams as this like spark plug offensive option, even if he does have to come off the bench. And if you're Charlotte, like what's the downside of trying to get value out of someone like Rozier, given the fact that he's probably not a long-term piece for the team? They're probably going to buy out someone like Gordon Hayward, maybe even move PJ Washington. They're not remotely close to having anything that kind of looks like a playoff team here, so might as well try and get value. Now, I understand that this is a weird list. That's why the video is titled what it is. Like, they should trade him, but they probably won't. And I wouldn't be surprised if none of these guys get moved, but it's always interesting to think a little bit more outside of the box in terms of who could or get moved, because it always seems like at the deadline there's a surprise team or a surprise player or two that get moved completely out of nowhere. And right now, a lot of the focus is on, Zach LaVine, Pascal Siakam, but a lot of these guys would really, really shake up, the trade market, the contending race if they were to get moved.